It's been a lifelong career in the agronomy world and primarily within the soils and crop nutrition side of agronomy. That's kind of been my passion. I've been carrying around one of these for my entire career pretty much. I think when I do retire, I'm just going to get it gold plated and hang it up in my office someplace because it'll be a great memorabilia. But I've put a lot of miles on soil probes over the years. I think, would it be fair to say there's a lot of mystique around soil test reports or discrepancies or misunderstandings and so on? And if there is, I'd certainly like to hear back from you. I don't have an overly structured presentation here today. There's a few things I do want to cover. I'd certainly like the questions to guide the presentation if need be as well. So if there are questions or whatever, please don't hesitate to kind of shout out or whatever. And I'd certainly like to answer those and go through those and maybe even provide some examples of what I'm talking about on some of these soil test reports that I do have here, these enlarged soil test reports. Now, when it comes to a soil test report, and you may have experienced this, but here's a soil test report. And basically almost all soil test reports, I just look at, there's two general areas. There's what the lab does, which is up here. A lab is an analytical body. They do good quality analysis. And so that's generally pretty reliable stuff. They've got good quality control. So that's the analytical part. The mystique comes in down here in the recommendations part. Now, some labs will provide recommendations, some not. And more I'm seeing the industry trend towards, this is a lab's job up here, this is an agronomist's job down here to make the recommendations based on what they know about the area, what they know about the results that are up here, what they know about the growers' practices. They're a little more in tune, I think, to make better recommendations down on this part, better than what a lab can actually do. The lab has some good guidelines. This is based on research results down here. But the local agronomist, I think, can fine-tune this maybe a little bit better. But here's the challenge. If I gave this analytical results to 5 different agronomists, you'd probably get 7 different opinions on what should be done. It gets... That's the reality of it. It's a little bit of a mystique. So you're going to get a little bit of my take on how I interpret a lot of these results that are going on. So first of all, do I have a preference for a lab? Not really. I don't want to promote one lab over the other. There's my soil test report. But I like a local lab that does a modified Kelowna extract for phosphorus. I'll get into what that is a little bit later. Because there'll be a reason for it. But again, labs, they're the analytical group, and they do good work. They all do good, some good analysis. So what about depth? That's the first thing. What depth do you folks take when you're doing a soil sample, or does your agronomist take? 0 to 12. Okay, anything else? 0 to 12? Yep. 0 to 6? Okay. It's fairly common. Anybody want to get down to 24 inches? You can. That's great. So what is the right or wrong? There isn't a right or a wrong, but here's how this would be my approach to doing it. If I'm kind of new to a field and I don't have a lot of history on the field, I'll take, I know it's a little archaic, but I'll use that. I like to get a good background level on a field, basically by taking, yeah, I think we can get down here. Oh yeah, we'll be all right. No gas escaping there. This is my high-tech system here. You take your 0 to 6. I've got this calibrated here, and I put my 6 to 12 in there. And then I'll go down to 24 inches with this unit, and this is why I like it. It's a telescopic unit. If I can, and it, yeah, and then it makes it really easy to bring it up. You give this to somebody, though, for the first time, and they'll get frustrated how to use it. It's a wicked combination.
You told them it's for soil, though, right?
Yeah. Now, Here's my little high-tech tools. Look at my bucket there. I stuck a little all thread down in there, 3/4 inch all thread. So if my soil probe gets a little bit plugged, push it out, falls right into the bucket, everything's pretty good that way. So that is what I like as a starting point for most fields. 0 to 6, then a 6 to 24 if you can. Why is that? As a lot of nutrients, the recommendations are based on a 0 to 6 inch sample. Unfortunately, my thing is gone there, but
You want to back up?
I think we'll be okay there. Most immobile nutrients, all the recommendations are based on a 0 to 6 inch sample. So that would be phosphorus, potassium, and most of the micronutrients. So that's good. You get a really good reading. The other one that you get a really good reading on a 0 to 6 is your pH. That's very important for herbicides. And organic matter, very important for herbicides as well. But the mobile nutrients, they move around the soil, so a little more depth is important there. And that's where I like to go to the 24 inch. So if you look on a soil test report, it would be nice to show you this in a little larger detail. Even if you send them, the lab, a sample that goes down to 24 inches, like this one right here, they will not analyze this, or the depth here, for phosphorus and potassium and for the micronutrients, because it doesn't mean anything to them. We don't know what those numbers mean. We know what they mean for 0 to 6, but not for the depth. So it's an all-encompassing way to get a good feel of the soil. You get really good results for the immobile nutrients and really good results for the mobile nutrients. Now, what about the next year or whenever you sample again? I wouldn't be overly concerned. That's where I go to a 0 to 12, because this gives me a good benchmark. All the analysis that are going to be done on 0 to 6 on the immobiles, nutrients, on pH, organic matter, micros, that's not going to change over time very quickly. So if you do a good job, get that soil test report, pin it up on your bulletin board and go, that's pretty stable. All these 0 to 6s will be pretty stable. You won't get a lot of change on phosphorus, potassium, pH, or anything. So try to get that one good sample if you can, kind of up front. Then every year after that, you could just do a 0 to 12 just to kind of keep things monitored a little bit. Then every 4, 5, 6 years maybe, go back and do the 0 to 6 and 6 to 12. Does that make sense or not to anybody? Is there any questions on that approach? Again, that's just kind of the first year out to get a really good handle on what the soil is. Any thoughts, Mike? What took you so long?
Okay, your dominant's going to tell you, you're going to shoot for a 50-60 foot.
Right.
Put the fertilizer in the ground, and it don't rain. It quits raining here once in a while. You know, you got all that money in there.
Right. So that's maybe a good argument for having a soil test report to see if how much nitrogen is actually left over. You have to take a look for it. Exactly. No, it's a very good point, Mike. It's a nice segue to what I wanted to talk about next. As an agronomist, and for growers that I've worked with a lot of times, or even growers that I haven't, if I know the soils in the area and I know their practices, this soil test report should not come back to me with any big surprises. It should be a confirmation of what I suspect already. Like, you know, if there's been manure applied to a piece of land, I'm going to expect some very high P and K levels. But if it's been a routine 70 pounds of nitrogen, 30 pounds of phosphate for the past 20, 30 years on this piece of land in a wheat canola rotation, I'm going to expect nitrogen to be low, phosphorus to be moderate, potassium probably is going to be okay, and sulfur, who cares? We really don't know because it's a very tough test to do because of a few things that I'll explain a little bit later. So it should be more of a confirmation than it is a revelation of what's going on if the agronomist is really in tune with what's happening in that local area. So when it comes to these nitrogen recommendations, it's kind of strange. It's not very scientific, but I assume that after a good crop, and this is not going to happen this year, that most soils will be fairly deficient in nitrogen. They will be. That's just going to happen. The crop is going to take out the nitrogen. And I have a couple of numbers. Now, I work a little bit further west of here in the dark brown soil zone. And I basically say that, look, if you're below 30 or 40 pounds of nitrogen, which is very common, I have two numbers. I know this is crude, this isn't very scientific, but I have two numbers. If you want to grow a good wheat crop, you should be in and around 100 pounds of nitrogen per acre. If you want to grow a good canola crop, you should be in and around 120. Now, taking it to this area, I'd have to scale that back a little bit, Ken, I'm assuming, right? I mean, 100 pounds of N for wheat is probably a little bit excess, I would think, in this area. Or I would be scaling it back 20 to 30 pounds for each of those two crops. But that's not a bad place to really start, rather than trying to figure out all the complexities of a nitrogen test, mineralization, immobilization, and denitrification, and all of that. That's kind of where it starts to shake out. Now, what about phosphorus is the other one. On a soil test report, does anyone know roughly what is your phosphorus levels? Any thoughts? 30 to 40? Anybody else? Now, here comes the big question. Is that parts per million? Is that pounds per acre? Is it 0 to 6, or is it 0 to 12?
0 to 12.
Okay. So then we have to back that number up because we need to get it to 0 to 6 because that's when the number means something to us a little bit. But one of the things, if I could have a redo soil test, not the recommendations, but the analysis, I would throw away the number that they're putting on there for the phosphorus. They often are putting on there, it's probably 20 or 30 or 40, Mike, like you're saying, or I've seen it as high as 50, sometimes above 100. I wish that could just be a scale, because people look at that as a true number that's available phosphorus. It's nothing to do with availability or anything like that. Nitrogen is available. It's because of its chemical makeup and so on, it is available. But the phosphorus is nothing more than an index. That could be simply a number from 1 to 10. 1 meaning you're really deficient, and 10 meaning don't put any more phosphate on the land. And everything kind of scales in between there. And 5 would mean put on as much phosphate as you take out of the land over a 4-year period and just keep it healthy that way. And if you're around 3, that means you got to pick up the phosphate a little bit. And if you're around 7, that means you got some flexibility to cut back in years when it's a little bit tighter, whatever. But it could be simply a scale of 1 to 10. My number when it comes to a soil test for phosphorus, I like to see it somewhere between that 30 and 50 pounds an acre. If I have to use the numbers the lab has given me, I like to see it around that 30 to 50 pounds an acre in the top 6 inches. Then that's telling me that you should be probably just maintaining a good maintenance program on phosphate. That means you probably are going to take out 30 to 35 pounds a year in this area. You should probably be putting that much back on average over a 4 or 5 year time frame. So it's a maintenance program. So those are that's my key number when it comes to phosphate. Somewhere in that 30 to 50 range, that's what I like to see. If it's above 50 and 60, I'm asking the question of, well, are you really putting on a lot of phosphate, or have you manured this land in the last few years? And quite often that'll guide you why that number is getting up there. I've seen it above 100. That's sometimes not good because that's a bit of an environmental problem. That's a little bit too much, and that's obviously a manured situation that we often see around Iron Springs area. If you've ever been through Feedlot Alley, it's hundreds of pounds an acre in that area. So that's the number I would look at if I were you, is if you're looking at a soil test report, if you're in that 30 to 50 range, you're probably doing a good job. Just kind of keep it up. Any potassium used in this area at all? Little here and there, maybe, probably not. We're not deficient in potassium at all. The number I look at for a soil test report, and again, it's an immobile nutrient, so it's 0 to 6. I look for 300 pounds. If it's above 300 pounds, not a concern. If you start getting down towards 300, then you start thinking about it a little bit for wheat and barley. Canola is not that responsive to potassium. So that is sort of the go-to number that I have for potassium. But generally not a problem, because I would have to say 99% of the soils in this area, I suspect, are high in potassium, I would think. So Then the other one is sulfur. That's a beast. It's mobile, so they will analyze it to depth if you give them a depth sample. The challenge with sulfur is that where I'm standing right here, the sulfur level could be very high, and where you folks are, it could be a little lower in the soil. It's highly variable. It's hard to get a representative sample. So we kind of almost ignore, well, we don't ignore it, but if I look at a sulfur level and it is indeed low, like less than 20 pounds in the top 2 feet, I'm going, you definitely have a sulfur deficiency. But if it has adequate levels, you could go, is that really representative of the entire field, or could there be pockets out there that are deficient? And that's the challenge with sulfur, is that there often are pockets that are deficient. We don't know where they are. We don't have the technology to figure that out, but that's why we fertilize with sulfur on canola and mustard crops, just to kind of cover those bases where there could be some deficiencies occurring throughout the field that you don't pick up in a soil test report. Micronutrients. Anything being applied for micros in the area? Someone's got to be trying some boron, I'm assuming. Boron, copper. Nothing with copper. Those are the only 2 micros I would be on the lookout for. Copper, we know the number on that one fairly well. That's based on research that I did some, Rigas Karamanis and various others. He put all the data together, actually. 0.4 parts per million. That's my go-to number on a 0 to 6 inch sample. If I'm below 0.4 parts per million, I'm thinking, I'm not going to recommend copper just yet, but I'm going to look for other symptoms. What type of soil is it? What type of crop symptoms are showing up? What's the tissue test looking like? But getting down to that 0.4, that's when that's kind of that critical level for copper. Boron, we don't know. I'll be honest with you. The likelihood of a boron response in this area is actually very low. The only place that's really had a true boron response or deficiency has been in northern Saskatchewan, and a couple of colleagues of mine. We've kind of come up with our own guideline, is that you shouldn't even be thinking about boron unless you can see jack pine trees on the horizon, which means you're on the edge of farmland, and that's where the boron deficiencies tend to be showing up in northern Saskatchewan and northern Alberta. So around here would be a bit of a rare event. And all the other micronutrients, highly unlikely there at all. So, any thoughts or questions then, folks? I'm just maybe rambling here, but...
I have a question for
yes,
you.
yep.
Power Rich, they got a starter fertilizer.
Right.
And you figure you can cut your weight in half.
Good question, Mike. The question is Power Rich, and they're not the only company. Many of them have what they feel is enhanced deficiency products where they're better. I would say that their phosphate in their products or nutrients are no better, no worse than any other phosphate products that are on the market today. So if you put on 5 pounds of their product, it's going to be same as putting on 5 pounds of monoammonium phosphate as well. So their phosphate is good. It's just not. It is not better. I'm going to be quite forthright. It is not more efficient. Here's the challenge, and I've done this in field trials. You can put on their product at 1/3 the rate, and it'll give you all the response you need. And you are sometimes led to the conclusion it is 3 times more effective. But here's what happens. You could put on your regular phosphate at 1/3 the rate, and it'll look the same way. The thing is, you're mining your soil by doing that. You're not putting on enough phosphate for the long term. So you're paying someone to mine your soil. And so I'm not a huge fan of this enhanced deficiency stuff. Is a little sketchy.
So once a bank is empty, it's going to show.
Oh gosh, if you empty your phosphate bank, it takes years to get it back again, and that's something that you don't want to go there with. It took, like right now, our phosphorus levels in our soils are actually pretty nice. They're getting up there, but it took 30, 40, 50 years to get them there. And now we're producing crops that are removing just as much as we're applying, so we're not building anymore, but we got to try to maintain. And I'm a huge proponent of replacement levels for phosphate.
Can you comment a little bit more on the modified Kelowna?
Oh yes, the modified Kelowna. When you send a soil sample to a lab, they have different ways of analyzing this, different chemicals they would use to figure out how much phosphorus is in that soil. And there's 4 or 5. There's ways of doing it. The one that we like in Alberta that provides the best reliability, and it's nowhere near 100% accurate, but it's the best, is it's called a modified Kelowna extract. It's a certain combination of chemicals. And Ross McKenzie did the work. I contributed a lot of the trials to his study back in the 90s. And he kind of went through all that with different extracts and so on, and basically said, this is the best extract for Alberta soils, is to use a modified Kelowna extract. It is the best predictor of a phosphate response. There's a Bray 1, there's a Bray 2 extract, there's a Mielik extract, there's an Olsen extract. They all produce different numbers, but it's hard to know what that number means. It's not as reliable. But the modified Kelowna produces the best, and that's why we kind of lean towards that number. So, there are labs, like I know A&L labs, and they're a great lab. I think quality control is second to none on all the labs, really. But they got the worst soil test report to try to interpret, though. But up here, I know they have Bray 1 and Bray 2. And I look at them and I go, oh gosh, they don't have a lot of meaning in an Alberta soil, unfortunately. They have a meaning in Ontario and in other soils, but in our soils, they just don't have a lot of meaning as to what that number really means. So, and that's the challenge with a lot of tissue or soil tests, is a lab can produce a number. That's easy. It's interpreting what is that number. Does that mean it's low? Does it mean it will respond? And if so, what type of product, and so on. And that's why I'm saying agronomists are having to come into the picture a little bit more to try to help filter through that responsive side, or the recommendation side of a soil test report.
Well, if you got a phos number, it's in parts per million, let's say.
Yeah, that's the first confusion, yeah.
Or this raglan thing here for a minute.
Yeah.
Is that all the phos that's actually in the soil?
Absolutely not. Not at all. Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. Okay. I've had this question asked a lot, a little bit different than this, but here's a phos number. It says 30. Is that available? Take that available thing, take it away, and just say, I wish that was an index number. There's thousands of pounds of phosphorus in our soil. Here's the challenge with phosphate. We could analyze for plant available phosphorus in our soils. No problem. It's probably a water extract. And it would be a pound an acre. 1, 1.5, maybe 2. And there's a lab in Nebraska that's doing this. And I don't think it has any fit here. So that's plant available. We have to have a soil test that doesn't only measure what's in the soil today. It has to give us an indication of what it's going to release through the growing season. That's the challenge with phosphorus. It's not what's in the soil today. It's how much is going to come out of the labile pool as the crop is growing. It's a predictor of release. And the modified Kelowna provides the better predictor of release. So that's why a snapshot of what's in the soil today that's plant available is of no value. It's that predicting tool that we need to have. I hope that answers your question on that.
Might explain why I had several years with less than 10 parts per million. Now that's from A&L. And excellent crops.
So your less than 10 parts per million is probably a Bray 1 or a Bray 2 phosphate or extract that's in there. And I don't know how that would convert to what a modified Kelowna. There are extrapolations that can be done on that. But less than 10 parts, but again, okay, you bring up another good point. 10 parts per million in a 0 to 6 inch sample is 20 pounds per acre. So this is this is where soil test, and I don't want to try to confuse folks too much here, but you got to watch out on soil test reports. They'll analyze in parts per million, but the numbers I'm talking are the pounds per acre, and you have to make that conversion. And for every 6 inches of soil, you have to multiply that number by 2. Because 6 inches of soil over 1 acre weighs approximately 2 million pounds. So your 10 is actually 20, so it's not as bad as it quite initially sounds at that level.
So phos fertilizer will sometimes also become unavailable in the soil. Is that right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, the phosphorus fertilizer that you put down ends up in that same pool as that natural background level eventually, and it just cycles its way through. So yes, the phosphorus, I mean, it's not a great efficiency number. If you put down 30 pounds of phosphate, if the crop uses 5 of that 30, you're doing pretty good, actually. The crop just gets the rest from the soil, or last year's phosphate, or previous 10 years phosphate, or so on.
So you want to have enough available for sufficient crop growth.
Yes.
If you have excess, it gets bound up in the soil pool. Really, is it more labile? Like there's a chance, because we talk about maintenance.
Right.
Is it really maintenance, or is the excess gone forever?
No, the excess is not gone forever. No, that's a really good point. Like let's say 5 out of the 30 gets into the crop, so you got 25 pounds. That's not gone too far away. That's not. There's different levels of availability. Phosphorus is a beast when it's in the soil. It's to understand. But there's different levels of availability. It doesn't go all the way to a rock kind of a thing in our soil. It does cycle back fairly quickly. So I'm still just a fairly huge proponent now after looking at many soil tests and crops. If on average you're removing 30 pounds of phosphate a year in your cropping rotation, probably should be putting on about 30 pounds of phosphate on average every year, and everything will be good. And as long as some of that's in the seed row, if you can. I still like the little in the seed row. It's a little older agronomist talking there, but I've always been a big proponent of some phosphate in the seed row.
That kind of lends me to my next question. I think we've seen that a lot this year, and I'm not sure if it's just phosphorus related or it's nitrogen related, but given the spring conditions that we've had, even though soil tests showed high background nitrogen and decent phosphorus, really kind of uneven crops. And it's not just germination, it's nutrient uptake, and I think it's a little bit related to the drought last year and perhaps not enough available early in the season.
The other question I have on that is, did anyone retest any of that stuff in the spring or what?
Yeah, we did.
I did, and it didn't look anywhere near the same.
Oh really? Like, are we talking nitrogen or phos? Because phos to me doesn't change as much. So you had high nitrogen in the fall and low in the spring?
Well, not low, but way lower.
Lower.
Yeah, you wouldn't ever expect the same. There will be a little fluctuation. It's an art in trying to determine how big should that fluctuation be, and then the next part is, if it's big, why is it happening? And again, that's where we as agronomists have to try to come in and figure that out a little bit.
That brings it down to a point about the sampling.
It does. Yeah, you're right. I mean, the variability. If you were to sample this field, 2 people sample this field today, you're going to get different results just because of where you take the samples. It's not a perfect science by any stretch. It's a great tool. I don't want to discredit soil testing at all. It's a great tool to have, but we just have to set our expectations around it. And I often say soil sampling and tissue sampling is nowhere near as accurate as when you give a blood test at a lab and they analyze it for something. They've got millions of data points to rely on. We don't have that in our world. So there's a little more subjectivity in our world than there is in, like I said, the human blood test or whatever. That's a pretty solid analysis. It's a good analysis, but we know what that number means a lot better than anything else. So, yes.
Now, are we better off to soil sampling first thing in the spring versus late in the fall?
Ideally, there shouldn't be a lot of change from late fall to early spring, but early spring would be the ideal just because it's the best snapshot of what's going on there, Mike, yes. But, I know there's always time crunches, but a late fall sample is still very reliable, and you can plan a little bit over the fall. But again, you should be taking a soil sample, and if you've been doing this every year, a soil sample shouldn't come back and surprise you in any way. You should know that the pH is going to come in probably in this area, I don't know, maybe between 7.5 and 8. And your organic matter is going to be around 2. And if it comes in at 7 or 8, well, you're going to question something, I hope. So a lot of stuff shouldn't be a surprise to you on that. It's a confirmation tool. It's a really good confirmation tool is the way I often utilize it.
Norm, is the wild pool being slowed down, the process of, I guess, becoming usable, is that being slowed down to possibly some of the coated fertilizers that are out there? And we've got NPKs, everything in one pearl now, coated. Is it releasing?
Good question. You know, when I think about the coatings that are being used, most of those coatings are designed to be gone within a couple of months, you know, and nutrients into the soil. Then the soil does with them what it would have done just 2 months earlier. So I don't think that is happening. I don't suspect it is anyways, but I'm only speculating on that, because the coatings they're meant to degrade reasonably within the year of application for the most part. So no, it's not. No, they're not. So, but that's probably another discussion there in terms of the fertilizer applications and where those products really have a good fit in our cropping systems. So, it was interesting. I would have a quiz for you if you wanted to. Up here, I had 2 soil tests. I had a field that looked very similar to the one actually across the road when I was driving up here. Where a grower had a lot of variability, and he's kind of what's going on in that field. So I took 2 samples, probably within the size of this tent from each other, from a couple of good spots and then a couple of poor spots, and these were significantly different. And I have those samples here if you wanted to look at them later, a good and a poor. And I look at it, and first of all, I look at the nitrogen. Which one do you think would have the highest level of nitrogen, the good or the poor? Some would say poor, probably some would say good, right? It was actually the good one, had a lower level of nitrogen because it was growing, it was consuming the nitrogen. A lot of the other nutrients were also lower in the good spot. So this is kind of, got to be careful how we interpret this. So I had to look at the soil test a little bit closer. The only thing I could really pinpoint that was truly different, and I did a very thorough sample on this, was the organic matter varied by almost 2% from the poor areas to the good areas. That's just natural field variability that exists. And it shows up once we start getting into drought conditions like we're seeing here. A lot of that variability shows up. Our soils are not uniform by any stretch of the imagination. And they will start to show their differences when Mother Nature does what she's doing right now in terms of creating the stress that we're seeing.
So you would advocate GPS locations and going back to the...
That's a good idea. I think that's an improvement in soil testing. That's a very good point, yes. To geo-reference those 15 and 20 spots and go right back to those locations each time. So that gets rid of that field variability so that when you are looking at differences from year to year, you know that it's more related to the annual variation rather than soil variation. So that is a good point, yes. Yeah. I know one of the labs used to be Exova, used to do a benchmark sample, what they would call it. It would take an area the size of this tent and only sample that area, and that area would represent the entire field. So they always came back to this area, punched their 10 or 15, 20 holes, and used that to represent the entire field. It's got pros and cons, but it tries to reduce the variability as well.
So how's your variable rate fertilizer working? You been testing on that?
I don't know. I don't know which hat do I have to wear to answer that question, though. It does work. The variable rate. I don't know. I got to be careful what I say, maybe. But my feelings is I love the concept. I think it's great. I really think it's a great concept. I just don't know if we've got it figured out yet, where we should be upping the rates and reducing rates and so on. I've seen some successes and I've seen some failures with it. So our consistency of good responses doesn't wow me just yet. I don't want to shelve the technology. I love the technology. I love the concept. But we got to keep working with this to figure it out. And we'll get there, but right now it's not. I'm not at the comfort level that I'd like to be at.
So I'd say one comment as well. I had a few fields done a couple of years ago, and this whole idea of reallocation with variable rate is wrong. It actually should just be more than this one. Like it cut back too much in some of my average areas, and I actually ended up losing field.
Yeah, and I combined for a fellow who had, and I'm combining his field, and I'm going, this crop should not be this poor here. We missed it here. I didn't do the prescription thing, but it was missed, and so we're not foolproof on it yet. That's all I'm saying. But I think we got to continue to learn it and work with it, and it's the same as a soil test report. if 5 different agronomists will give you 7 different opinions on how to do a variable rate, and because we don't quite have it nailed down yet in terms of.
Well, this might be a little off the track, but it stays with soil variability. You know, we got a rolling topography. We got peas last year with Group 2 chemical, and really thin wheat on the knolls, and fine in the low spots.
Group 2 chemistry, there's possibility of some residual. Hence, that's why I like a 0 to 6 inch sample, so I get a good feel on your pH and your organic matter, because that's going to help diagnose that problem a little bit. But I suspect there could be, I mean, let's face it, this year, half the fields that I've been walking in the month of June were for problems were herbicide carryover related. Because if you look at last year's weather records, June the 15th, we were on average, we had excellent crops to June the 15th last year. The tap shut off, I think it was on June the 15th, and it was flatlined until about October. And so a lot of that herbicide is still, unfortunately, causing us some issues this year. And hilltops would be the prime place for that.
Is that tied directly to the amount of organic matter?
Depends on the chemistry, and you're getting into an area I'm not as comfortable with, but it's a pH and organic matter effect, but depending on what type of chemistry it is would influence that. So yeah. But,
actually, a lot of fields have residual issues this year, and on chemistries that we don't normally see issues, and I suspect they're going to be changing some labels based on the Rex this year.
It's quite possible, yeah. They might tighten it up a little bit, but yeah, you're right. A lot of the fields I've been in, I've looked at them. I go, they followed all the right rules. You can grow canola after infinity. That's not a problem in the dark brown soil zone, but it was this year. So it's not, you know, it's just a matter of circumstances this year. The other thing that I was just going to migrate back a little bit to on the soil test reports, and again, this is just another version of a recommendation or it's an analysis tool. A&L does this a lot. Other labs will do it if you want them, but A&L does it quite routinely. Up here in this corner of an A&L soil test report, and like I said, they do great work, these guys, but their soil test reports are terrible. They don't put N, P, and K in the sequential columns. They scatter them around for whatever reason. It's simple stuff could be fixed. Anyways, I just wanted to talk to this stuff up here. It's something they call percent base saturation. Ross McKenzie calls it percent BS. And I have to agree with him a little bit on that. Some agronomists will use that to make recommendations. It's based a little bit on ratios of nutrients in the soil. It's primarily ratios of magnesium to potassium. And they'll try to generate a potassium recommendation based on that. It doesn't work. Bottom line is there's scientific evidence in Western Canada. It's no better than just using the methodology that I already described. If your soil test is below 30, you need phosphorus. If it's below 300 on potassium, you need potassium. That's still very reliable. The ratios just aren't working. They might work in some 0.2% organic matter soils that are sandy in some parts of the world, but in our environment they don't work, especially for those nutrients, primarily because we're abundant in all of them anyway. So ratios aren't important if you already have an abundance of these nutrients. It's like the buffet we had. Was anybody worried about the ratio of their nutrients they were picking up out of that buffet today? No, you were. Yeah, you got your ratio. You don't have to, you got more than enough of every nutrient right there. You don't have to worry about if you're getting them in the right ratio. And that's kind of the way it is in our prairie soils. We don't have to worry about those ratios that much. So it's a bit of just another tool that some use. I don't, again, because I haven't seen the scientific evidence of it primarily, and I haven't really bought into it that much. But again, I've been referred to as a bit of a meat and potatoes agronomist. And I go, yes, I know I am kind of basic meat and potatoes, but I do like doing exotic food every now and then. But that's how I treat crop nutrition. Let's do the meat and potatoes, but let's play around or try some exotic stuff. But we don't invest the whole farm in it. That's often the approach that I would like to take. So be careful of that. If someone's talking about ratios of nutrients and so on, it's not well-founded stuff. So. Anything else that's kind of burning, or did I maybe touch a sensitive topic there or not?
What's your opinion on how often you should soil test?
I guess ideally, I'll go right back to that. I like my 0 to 6, 6 to 24, once every 5 years. And if a couple of times in between there you did a 0 to 12 just to kind of keep things monitored, that would be adequate. I don't think it would have to be every year. So that would be you'd be on a good program if you were to do that. So, but I still like that 0 to 6, 6 to 24, because a lot of what we want to know is in that top 6 inches of soil. And I think we mask it if we only do a 0 to 12. So every now and then get that 0 to 6 in there to find out what's going on.
Are there any better responses to liquid versus granular?
No. Well, good question. The question is there any better responses to liquid versus granular? The short answer to that is no. And I'll just qualify that a little bit, but the general thinking is if you're putting on granular fertilizer in the spring, or liquid, or even anhydrous ammonia right at the time that you're seeding, those 3 products all work the same. Agronomically, the decision to the grower is one of economics, logistics. It's not an agronomic concern at all. Now, if you're going in the fall, we change that up a little bit. We kind of shy away from liquid a little bit for a fall application. But for spring, treat them all the same if you're banding them in the same. Good question. If you wanted to go through this one or not.
Oh, it doesn't matter to me, no?
Yeah, we'll just if they wanted to hand this one out, and then we can kind of wrap that up with the soil test. That's a good question. I'm a little cautious on that. Yeah. Well, maybe while Ken's handing that out, a gentleman had a very good question here about spraying liquid fertilizer on snow. Boy, that's delicate, because if you can guarantee me that snow is going to melt and soak into the soil, it's a go. But where did all that snow melt go that we had this spring?
Pond.
I think it's probably in Hudson Bay by now. Yeah. So be very careful on this snow thing. Yes, I will recommend it in the spring of the year if it's the month of April and the ground is thawed out completely and we get a nice 3 to 4 inches of wet snow. Yes, urea or liquid on top of that, and the snow melts in, takes the fertilizer in, it's fine. But it's very specific. You can't make a general recommendation on that. It's risky. I'm not a big fan of putting fertilizer on snow, especially if that snow is on frozen ground. It doesn't happen. So on this soil test report, and you can see this is, when I looked at this, and I don't know the area all that well, I spend more of my time in the dark brown soil zone. This soil test report doesn't really surprise me, because I know this is continuous cropland. I'm assuming here, isn't it? For the most part. Okay, and so your nitrogen is deficient. Like I said, if it's below 40, it's going to be deficient. So you're at 22 pounds in the top 2 feet, fairly deficient. Phosphorus at 11 pounds, that's quite deficient. Now I'm going to suspect that. I'm thinking it's a little on the lower side. How many years ago since this land has been summer fallowed would be some of the questions I would be asking. 5 years, yeah. Okay, now I'm going to attribute that lower level to some of the summer fallowing that has gone on over the last number of years. And that's another whole complex soil chemistry thing. But the phosphorus in this case, when I look at 11, I would be saying that if I was to make a recommendation, and I'm not thinking economics, I know, and you have to factor the economics in. I would like to see, in this case, a few extra pounds of phosphorus applied every year over and above what the crop is going to remove. I'd like to see that number try to come up over time. You aren't going to bring this up from 11 to 30 in 1 or 2 years unless you have a tax problem you want to get rid of and broadcast a couple 100 pounds of phosphate on the land or something like that. But it does probably require a little bit more phosphorus than what the crop is removing, is how I would interpret that. Once it gets around that 30 to 40 pound range, then I think you would be in a nice stable pattern. Potassium, you've noticed it's at 565. My go-to number there is 300. How close to 300 are you? You're a long ways from 300. So there's no problem with potassium in this soil, nor is there in probably any of the soils in this area. Sulfur, in this case it's 24. It's kind of going, it is a little on the marginal side. You could suspect there may be some small pockets of deficiency actually occurring in this area. Have you ever had any confirmation of sulfur responses or not in your area? It's a little unusual in the brown, but it's not. Sulfur has caught me by surprise a number of cases that I am getting responses from it. So in this case, this is a grower decision, but I would say, 5 or 10 pounds of sulfur would at least alleviate any potential problem that would exist in that case. Zinc, I don't know what the critical number is, and I'm not even sure how they're analyzing this zinc here. It's odd that on the micronutrients they actually analyze the two depths down below, 6 to 12 and 12 to 24. But I believe on the 0 to 6 inch sample, I wouldn't worry about zinc too much until you get below about 0.5, and we're at 0.9 on this one. Probably not a problem, not overly surprising. Boron is 0.4. We don't know what the critical level is. We just know that we get very few, if any, boron responses in our crops here. Copper at 1.2, that to me is abundant. That's where I look for 0.4. If that number was 0.4, then I'm going, okay, we're going to do a little more investigating on your land at 0.4. Iron, which is Fe, and manganese, I don't know what the number should be. That's just never really been a problem. So they're just being analyzed. According to the bar charts, it looks like it's okay on this. But here's what kind of confirms what I was talking about a little earlier. Look at the recommendation this lab is making, which is Down to Earth Labs, for canola in this area is 100 pounds of nitrogen. And that's kind of my go-to number. When I'm seeing deficiencies like that, my number is 120, but again, I'm in a little bit higher moisture area, so like I said, I'd back that off. But yeah, they're talking 100 pounds of nitrogen for canola and 90 pounds for wheat, which kind of fits with what I see growers doing. So like I said, my two numbers are 100 and 120, but I'm going to back it off by 20 pounds for each one, and I'm right in the ballpark for that nitrogen level. They are recommending sulfur, but that's just for insurance purposes. 20 pounds, that's maybe a little on the high side, I think, for what we would need here. They didn't do percent base saturation, which is kind of in the middle of the page, middle right-hand side. That's good because it means nothing. You can see that's where those ratios come into the picture. And they've got organic matter 2%. That's kind of what I would expect in this area. And pH at 7.7. That's pretty common, I would suspect, for this high lime soil that we're dealing with. And no salinity problems, which is the soluble salts on here. So all in all, it's nothing out of the ordinary here, I would have to say, on this soil test report. Other than maybe the phosphorus is a little lower than I'm accustomed to seeing, but the history of summer fallow kind of addresses where that's coming from. Any questions then, folks, on that?
So if you don't need any micronutrients,
right?
Why are there so many people recommending that? Zinc and boron.
You said it, no? Yeah. Yeah, please. Okay, let's say do we need them? No. I'll recommend micronutrients myself, but only on a small scale basis, test basis. The likelihood of a micronutrient, here's how I look at a lot of these products that are claiming whatever. If your confidence level is only 10% that you're going to get a response to it, you should only try it on 10% of your acres. And that's what we should be doing with micronutrients, is just trying them out here and there, getting to know your own situation a little bit. So it's not to say that we'll never need them. I'm just kind of giving you the big picture odds. The likelihood of a response is fairly small, so use them accordingly. Do the testing in accordance with that likelihood.
Because I know of a person, he does a lot of business with a lot of acres. And it's from Medicine Hat all the way to Empress. Without a doubt, there's big time zinc deficiency. That's his wording, not mine. I can't see it on my test either.
You know, and there was a number of, I think Larry may have been involved in this at one time, zinc deficiencies. Was there not in southern Alberta at one time? Or it was perceived to be a lot of zinc deficiencies with beans and corn and so on. So it'd be like the third micronutrient on the list today in terms of a lookout for. Copper is number 1, boron is number 2, but I'm going to put boron as very distant. Zinc would be number 3. But the researcher out of Saskatchewan, Jeff Shano, has done a lot of work with zinc, and he can't find those responses either with it. So it's a little bit of speculation. And but please do try doing some of these things on smaller scales because don't wait for the researchers to give you all the answers. Those days are gone where the researchers are going to figure it all out. Sorry, Ken, you're not. I'm glad to see we still have some research going on, but in my career, I've seen the research scale back to it's tremendous reduction in the amount of research. So the research is now in the hands of you folks, the growers, to figure out a lot of this stuff. You got guidance with guys like Ken and some local agronomists, but don't wait until they figure it out 100%. You have to do a little of your own testing on that. But again, I wouldn't do the whole farm. That's my only cautionary statement. Yes.
I got a comment about, I guess this will be giving away some age, but when we were doing our CCA years ago, Westco and stuff.
Yes.
Probably about 30 years ago when we were doing this.
Not that. Yeah, it was, well, late 90s. Yeah, that was when we first started. Yep.
We were taking and bringing soil samples in, soil results.
Right.
And one thing that amazes me is back in those days, and that's when you did the soil test results. You always seen the micronutrients right up there. Right. 100%. Do not need it. Do not need it. That being said, though, 20 years later, some of those same farms that I'm talking about, now we're starting to show up that it's saying, oh, this is low, this is low, this is low. I place a lot of that into our crop rotations. Years ago, there's a rotation of wheat, barley. Now we've got a lot of pulses. So there is some being removed.
Oh, absolutely.
I agree with you. It's something to try if the results are showing that you've depleted. Whoever's been around long enough, must have soil tests for 20 years ago. Pull them up and look at the new test done today and have a look at what's going on in your soil.
And that's the value of the long-term program. You don't have to have that sample every year, but if you could have a sample every 4 or 5 years and monitor that thing, I agree. I mean, there's no question. When I say I'll use potassium as an example. We don't need potassium today. But you're removing potassium from this soil every year. That statement isn't going to be ingrained forever. We will eventually need some of these nutrients because we're removing them from the soil. It's whether or not do we need them for ours or for our children or our grandchildren are going to sooner or later require these nutrients. So, and that's a very good point. They are being drawn out of the soil. And I don't know how big the reserve is on some of those.
Well, that's what I find. How big is the reserve?
And that we don't.
You need 10 micros. I mean, there's what, 18 different micros in soil. Maybe you only need 1 or 2. You don't need a full package of them. We are depleting.
Yes. And again, I'll throw it back to the growers where this is where you kind of have to pick and choose which one you want to play with a little bit because as researchers, a lot of research has been done on micronutrients and a lot of it has come up empty. So it's not exciting research for many researchers because they try it and no response. But that's not to say you won't see it, but it guides you a little bit though. So, good comments. Appreciate that. Thanks.
I think we're going to wrap it up if that's okay with you.
That's good with me, but is there any other questions? Or I have some tests here if they want to go over some soil tests. Sure. Any questions? Sure.
Well, I want to thank you very much, Norm, for coming down and having a great discussion. So join me in thanking Norm.
Thanks a lot, folks.